Okay, we're gonna wait maybe a minute or so for other people to come in.
Mhm.
Okay, I think we'll get started. Yeah, and hopefully more people will come in and yeah. So welcome everyone to our first of two virtual lectures on the significance of comics and graphic novels. These lectures were made possible by a grant from the Friends of the Humanities, for which we also acquired various graphic narratives to add to the library collection. My name is Zach Stein, and I am the head of special collections at Edith Garland Dupre Library and one of the principal investigators of this grant.
Hi, I'm Janelle Zeddy. I'm also one of the principal investigators of the grant, and I'm the head of cataloging at Dupre Library.
Right. Tonight's lecture covers intermediality in French comics. Through examples of artwork from a variety of recent publications, our guest lecturer, Dr. Fabrice Leroy, will discuss intermediality for the use of mixed media in comics and graphic novels that engage in a productive interface with other visual arts, such as photography, film, reportage, painting, and video games, among others. Before I introduce tonight's lecturer, I will remind you that video and audio will be kept off and the chat will be disabled. If you have questions, you may post them in the Q&A, and I will read them at the end of the lecture. This is a safe space, and we ask that you be respectful. The lecture is being recorded and will be made available on Dupre Library's YouTube channel. Tonight's lecturer is Dr. Fabrice Leroy, professor of French and Francophone studies at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He has published numerous book chapters on Francophone literature and graphic novels, as well as articles in leading scholarly journals. His most recent monographs devoted to comics focus on contemporary French authors, Johann Spar and Pierre Lapolice. He recently co-edited a book of essays on intermediality in French language comics and graphic novels with UL Press, the subject of this evening's talk, and is one of the editors of the Cambridge Companion to the American Graphic Novel, coming out in 2023 with Cambridge University Press. So without further ado, I hand it over to Dr. Leroy.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Zach. Good evening or good afternoon. I'm not quite sure which it is at this point. We're in between. I wanted to thank the event coordinators for inviting me to speak today, and also wanted to thank them for securing this grant with the Friends of the Humanities to make more comic books and graphic novels available to the UL Dupre Library. I think it's wonderful that our students and our faculty have access to these treasures of art and information. So my talk today has a rather wouldn't call it pretentious title, but the word intermediality can be a little complicated. Simply, intermediality is referring to the fact that comics have a mix of sources. As you know, comics are text-based in part and also image-based in part, and the nature of comics is a hybrid of two different media. But beyond that, also comics can mix in references to other forms of media, visual media such as photography and film, video games, photo novels. There's all kinds of possibilities for comics to create a dialogue with other art forms and to create these connections. So I will simply start with the origins of comics. As you know, comics started in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And early comics were already conscious of this blending of two things, of text and image. So if you see here on the left of the screen, you have an example from a French comic called Bécassine from the early 1900s. And on the right, you have something from the late 1920s by Hergé, the inventor of the Tintin Tintin character who will rise to fame later on in the 1930s. And you can see both of them are trying to mix two things. There's something image-based. There's a series of little vignettes and panels. Sometimes they are framed, sometimes they are not. And you also have below the text, this is before the invention of the speech balloon. In this case, the texts are below the image, and they're trying to create something that can be read by combining two different things. Beyond that, as you can see, there's also references to literature. If you look at the example from Bécassine on the left, the images use typography. It's a printed text. You have quotation marks, you have hyphens, you have all the standard components of print narratives. And also you have one frame one image is framed, there's a circle around it, and this alludes to portrait photography. The circle around the frame references the history of painting, the history of photography. So there's something hybrid on this side. On the other side, the text presents itself as a film. It says un grand film comique, a big comic movie. So Hergé's reference here is cinema. He's thinking in terms of sequential narratives, frame to frame narratives. He's very influenced by early slapstick films by Chaplin and other people. And he's trying to replicate what film can do with images and with text. So on one side, you have a sort of a literary hybrid, an illustrated narrative with images on top of text. On the other side, you have something trying to ape cinema. And those are some of the founding text of comics. So intermediality is already built in the medium of comics from the beginning. And artists will always tend to play with these possibilities of connecting with the other arts. So here's an example of one of the discussions we have in the book. So the book is called Intermediality in French Language Comics and Graphic Novels. It contains 13 chapters. And one of the chapters is devoted to a graphic novel about a French filmmaker. So the French filmmaker is named Edouard Luns. He is a filmmaker from the French New Wave generation. He did this sort of cinéma vérité type of stories where he would film people in the poor parts of Paris in the 1950s. It was very documentary based, and it was also about social issues. And the comic book is trying to replicate images from that movie because the original movies have been lost. Edouard Luns is a filmmaker whose films were not very well preserved for many reasons. And the cartoonist and the scriptwriter of this comic book are trying to access something which is no longer visible by most viewers. So they're trying to provide a replica, a graphic replica of a movie which is no longer available to most viewers. And so as you can see on the left side, the movie is called Le Grabuge. It's a 1960s release. And you have all the components of people watching a movie. So you have the screen showing the movie, the title of the movie, you have the viewers in the room, and you have photograms, so little stills from the movie, which have been redrawn to give you an equivalent of what the movie was about. Beyond replicating, there's also in this graphic novel an attempt at reconnecting with these movies. So the scriptwriter and the artist have a very emotional attachment to these early films by this filmmaker. And they end up inserting themselves into the movies. So if you look on the right side, I'm sorry, the cartoonist draws himself inside the movie, climbing up a scaffold to go sit next to the characters that are depicted in the movie itself. And it's this fantasy of reconnection with something from the past, which is no longer available to us. And it's allowed by the visual medium of comics. You can simply replicate the images, but you can also inscribe yourself within some of these images and create a more productive dialogue with them. So the entire graphic novel functions like this. Part of it is replication. It's trying to copy in a semi-realistic style the images in black and white from the original movies for people who no longer can see those movies. But there's also this more effective, this more personal reconnection with these movies. And it's accomplished through what we call braiding in comics. Braiding is a form of intertwining different types of images, as a braid. And so here you have the images from the movie, but also the images from the cartoonist placing himself inside the story. So in terms of visual constructs, would be very difficult to accomplish in other media. It's really something that comics or graphic novels can do with ease because of the flexibility of simply drawing or redrawing images. Another chapter of this book is about film also, but it's the reverse configuration. It's essentially films alluding to comics and the dialogue between the two, but in reverse. And the example that is chosen by this chapter is Jean-Luc Godard. Jean-Luc Godard passed away last week, I believe. So it's unfortunately quite timely to speak about him. Jean-Luc Godard was a French New Wave filmmaker, as you all know. And one of his famous movies is called Pierrot le Fou. And in Pierrot le Fou, you have these two characters, Anna Karenina and Jean-Pierre Belmondo, and they're constantly shown reading comics. And it's not just any comic series, it's something called Les Pieds Nickelés. It's a French comic series from the 1930s and 1940s. And it's a very anti-establishment, corrosive kind of humor. These are tricksters, poking fun at the authorities, always putting themselves in very, very difficult situation, protesting against police brutality, protesting against the French political regime in general. And the choice that Godard made to reference this series is not a random choice. Godard was very aware of the subversive nature of this comic series, and he's making parallels between that series and his true characters. So if you've read or if you've seen Pierrot le Fou, it's a road movie where these two people, man and woman, sort of run away from everything and everybody. They run away from the Algerian war, they run away from the police, they run away from the mafia, and they're constantly on the go. And it's a reflection on marginality, in a sense, this movie, and it was very successful in those days. And so the fact that it references comics throughout is sort of a thematic parallel that the film is doing with that very specific series. And throughout the film also, there are other references to other comics or other graphic novels. You'll see on the left here, there's an image from a very pulp-like magazine from the 1950s or 1960s called Mr. X. And Godard shows that on a table somewhere in the movie. There are posters on the wall. So it's interspersed with little elements of graphic narratives or comic books. And it's part of Godard's deconstruction of the film medium. It's done very intentionally. It's this sort of cut-up technique, this postmodern cut-up technique that Godard was using. And he's looking for a comics aesthetic in film, which is in itself a very interesting device that he's trying to accomplish. Another chapter deals with a much more serious subject, and it's of course the Holocaust. And it's the work by a cartoonist, a French-German Jewish cartoonist named Horst Rosenthal. And Horst Rosenthal was an artist before the war. He had already done some publications of some drawings, and he found himself interned at a French concentration camp called Gurs, G-U-R-S, in the south of France. And while at that camp, he wrote, using whatever means he had at his disposal, a story of Mickey Mouse. And it's called Mickey in the Camp of Gurs. So he's placing this famous American comic character inside a very real and very traumatic and very, very, very horrible social, political, historical context. And so you have this interesting mix of two things. You have photographies. He's using aerial photographs, and nobody knows how he acquired those at the camp, but photographs of the actual camp where he's interned, and then a story about himself being a prisoner of this camp. And he's using Mickey Mouse, Disney character, as a way to tell his story. So it's both very heavy and very light. It's both drawn and photographed. You have this clash of many different things, including the most serious topic, which is the Holocaust. And of course, it may have had an influence on Maus, the famous graphic novel by Art Spiegelman, which depicts the Jews as mice and the Nazis as cats. It's a masterpiece of the graphic novel that everyone probably has read or not. Somebody should read it. It's a classic for every classroom these days. So it's a very, it's a unique document, this graphic attempt at speaking about the Holocaust with fragments of the comics language and also fragments of autobiography and then fragments of photography. And it creates, again, a braiding of different types of text and types of images. So it's a fascinating object. It's also a very sad object for the reasons that you understand, of course, and Rosenthal died in the Holocaust, so it makes it even more poignant that we have this testimony of his work to reflect on today. Much lighter in tone, of course, is the case of the photo novel. So we have a chapter in this book about this unique cultural form called the photo novel. And if you know the photo novel, it was something very much in vogue after World War II in European countries, mostly in Italy and in France. It was designed for a very working class audience, often a working class audience who could not afford going to the movies. So a lot of photo novels are film photo novels. They reuse stills from films that have been cut up and laid on the page in the same kind of layout as a comics story, so sequential frames next to each other with text included in speech balloons or below the image. And it's a medium that mixes photography, obviously, cinema, because a lot of it is influenced by the visual forms of cinema, and also comics, because some photo novels were drawn photo novels. So they use drawing to convey meaning. And as you can see on the screen here, you have the two types. So on the left side of the screen, you have photo novel, I mean, the drawn photo novel. You have drawn images, drawn very realistically, photorealistically, if you mean, but it's still an organic drawing drawn by hand. On the other side, you have the photo novel using actual pictures. The stories are typically very sappy. You know, it's a very emotional medium. It's melodramatic. Often it's about love stories. It's about gender relations, and it's something that we may find a little kitsch to read today. My mother used to read photo novels. My grandmother used to read photo novels, and it's not a medium that is practiced very much today. But it's really a time capsule of the post-war years for a certain kind of readership, often a working class or middle class readership. For people who were movie lovers but could not really afford going to the movies very often, and for people who were accustomed to reading comic books, who were accustomed to have their gaze travel on the page from top to bottom, from right to left, and following a sequence of actions, sequence of dialogues, and constructing a mental picture of what this means. So it takes a decoding ability that comes from having been exposed to comics and graphic novels. So the photo novel is a fascinating genre. The person who wrote this chapter is Jan Battens, one of my co-editors, who's a specialist of the field. He's written several books on the film photo novel and the photo novel, and he has this personal connection of thousands of images. He really collects that stuff, so he's a real expert of this. And he's drawing many parallels between graphic novels and the photo novel, which again are very interesting in terms of intermediality. Another one which we could connect to the news today. So Godard just passed away. I didn't really plan for this, but this is current event. Now we know things are happening in Iran right now. So there's a chapter in our book about Persepolis. You know, Persepolis is probably it's a rather well-known graphic memoir. So we don't know if we can call it a graphic novel because it's not fiction. It's not a graphic fiction. It is based on reality. Marjane Satrapi is an Iranian-French author who tells the story of her life in this very bold black and white style. You can see that on the left of the image, and I'm sure you're familiar with this because it's also an animated film. You may have seen the animated version of this. It was published in France. And it's a personal narrative of leaving Iran after the Islamic Revolution, because she belongs to a world that is threatened by the Islamic Revolution, a world of intellectuals and people who are rather progressive in terms of their social habits. And her parents sent her away. She simply doesn't fit in Iran anymore. And she goes to France. It's not a good experience at first. She goes back to Iran, then she goes back to France again. What the person here, the scholar, is doing with this is trying to find parallels between the way martyrdom is depicted, the way the suffering of the young Margie, the main character, is depicted, with religious iconography. So you have famous religious artwork, statues, what you call the Pietà pose, the martyr pose of a dead body being held by someone. It's a Christian tradition throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the Renaissance, and we have many examples of that pose in the visual arts, in the history of painting. But it's also an iconography of murals. So in Iran, there was a cult of martyrs, of people who died for the revolution, and they were celebrated by being shown on these giant murals in the city, held in the same position. So there's again, a very calculated attempt by Marjane Satrapi to create a parallel among all these types of images, coming from art history, coming from history of the Western religious, mostly Catholic tradition, from the Muslim tradition, from the mural tradition in Iran, and then trying to express herself in the story of her own life using these templates, using these types of images. So the picture on the left, where this is Margie's mother, she faints at the airport when Margie goes to Switzerland for the first time, when she flies away from Iran out of grief. She simply cannot bear it, and she faints at the airport, and her father is holding her limp, unconscious body. There are many examples of that pose throughout the story, and it's a very interesting study done in this chapter, because it's informed by art history, and it's also informed by what goes on in Iran right now. So we have in the book photographs of street pictures taken by people in various parts of Tehran, showing these types of images. So there's a mix of very current type of events, and then history from the past, and then of course what the graphic novelist is trying to accomplish in her own work. So if you also have not read Persepolis, maybe I would advise to start with the cartoon version, the animated version, because it's easily accessible. It's on Netflix, I'm sure, or other platforms like Netflix. And of course, you can buy the complete Persepolis in a single volume these days. I think it was translated in English by Fantagraphics. It's very easy to purchase, and it's one of great places to start if you're interested in graphic narrative, because it's really strong story. It's very well. The artwork is very interesting. It's become a classic, even though it's not written in English. It's influenced a lot of graphic memoirs written in English after that. Trying not to go too fast or too slow. Another chapter in the book is much more focused on experimentation in graphic novels. It's interested in the fact that in art history, there's a label called art brut. It's in English, I believe, outsider art or untrained art. So it's art made by people who have not been exposed to much training, much formal training. It's art done by children, by people who are socially alienated and just work on their own. They have no intention of publishing their work. They don't work within the circuits of publication or art as we know it. They are rather naive. Often their technique is not a learned technique. And a French artist named Jean Dubuffet coined the phrase art brut in the 20th century to create a label for this type of naive, untrained, unsophisticated art. He was collecting those works. And his notion, Dubuffet's notion, was that it's a place for inventiveness. When people are not taught how to draw, how to compose an image, they're not taught technique, they're also very free to invent things that no one has really thought of. Out of sheer naivete, out of sheer imagination, they're not replicating learned formulas. They're inventing something new on their own. And that's another tendency that graphic novelists can do. So a lot of graphic novelists are very well trained. They've gone to art school. They have a BFA, a Bachelor in Fine Arts. They can paint, they can sculpt. They are very well trained. They know the history of art. They have technique. A lot of them also very much self-trained, start with almost zero competence in graphic terms and build something from scratch. And in doing that, what they do sometimes is very inventive. The lack of training can free a lot of people to create a different world, a different look, a different style. So this is an example of a graphic novel in which a mother and a daughter juxtapose their work. So you have the mother on the left, draws herself, and then her child also draws herself. And it's an exercise in rebuilding a relationship between the mother and the daughter. It's based in trauma, it's based in difficult circumstances, but drawing becomes the glue that helps the family heal from trauma, and it's accomplished by juxtaposition of different images. So it's interesting because if you look at a graphic novel, you may see some that are very technically advanced, where the style is masterful, and you look at this thinking that this person is a real artist. If you took a frame from that comic book and you put it in a museum, people would say this is a painting, or this is done by somebody who's technically very proficient. And some of the comic books, some of the graphic novels, you'll find that it's very minimalistic, it's very basic, and it doesn't have to be that fancy to carry a good story. We have good examples in the history of graphic novels where the artwork is not particularly advanced or sophisticated, but it's good enough to tell a good story. And in fact, it's rather endearing. You know, this unsophisticated look can be very touching because it's human, because it's real, and because all children doodle. We all draw, we all doodle, we all have the same upbringing. We've all attempted to draw ourselves, you know, and your parents would keep that on the fridge at the house. So we can connect with that through our own experience as well. The act of doodling or sketching without any kind of training. So there's something fresh, there's something real about this kind of artwork, and it's another growing tendency within the field of graphic novels, especially when you deal with topics of childhood. Of course, it would not be a complete survey of intermediality or possibilities for intermediate configurations if we didn't speak about video games. I'm too old to have been part of the video game generation. My children, of course, have grown up with video games. The video games, as you know, are also a visual form. They can also be a narrative form. A lot of video games are based on building a story or following the path of a story. And the case which is studied here is a double case of intermediality. So we have an original text. It's a novel by French novelist Gustave Flaubert, 19th century French realist. It's called Salammbô. It's a very difficult, very dense text that people learn in lit classes if they grow up in French-speaking countries. There's a graphic novel version of this from the 1970s by Philippe Drouillet. Philippe Drouillet was a genius of graphic noveling, very complicated style, very ambitious, full of strange panels. He works in a style of science fiction. He's influenced a lot of people. So there's already one transmedial adaptation, you know, from one medium to another, from literature to comics, and it's Philippe Drouillet's version of Salammbô. But then that became the source of a video game, and the video game uses images from the comic book to put you as a user inside the novel. So if you are playing this game, you become the main character of Salammbô, of the story. It's also been turned into a space opera, so you don't really recognize Flaubert's original novel too well. You're more into the world of the graphic novel, but you play a part in the novel, and you have to acquire the permission to move from one stage to another. So you have to go through a narrative path where you encounter some people, you engage in fight or in dialogue or in negotiation with different people to move to the next step. And this follows roughly the path of the character in the story. So it's a fascinating video game because it's a triple layer of literature, graphic novel, and video aesthetics, and role playing and game playing. All those things are combined into a single object, which is rather dense because it has all these layers, all these complications. So it's a fairly older game by gaming standards. It's about 10 years old, so video games age very quickly, and it may not be something that people still play very much today, but there are other examples of this. There are other examples of graphic novels turned into video games. And of course, you can think of all the Batmans and all the superhero stories that started on the page and became screen experiences. So there's a possibility of shifting from one to the other. And this is another example, and I believe this is the last one, so I hope I didn't go too fast or too slow. I'm checking the time. I think we're pretty good. This one is about music and comics. So that's another paradox, if you mean, because obviously comics are silent medium. Sound is only visually represented through onomatopoeia and sound effects. There's a bing here in the third panel, somebody headbutting somebody, but it cannot produce an actual sound, of course. So the writer of this chapter is very interested in trying to see how music can be referenced in the graphic novel. And it's more than music because in this sense, he's dealing with a series of authors who come from a French post-colonial background. So what I mean by that is that, as you know, France had colonies in various places around the world, especially in the Maghreb, in North Africa. And when these colonies were disbanded and these countries became independent, a lot of citizens from these countries moved to France, and contemporary French society is very multicultural, and there's a lot of people coming from different places of the older French Empire. This creates, of course, different political discourses, pro and against, as immigration tends to create. And so my friend Mark McKinney, who wrote this chapter, is looking at how the culture of North African immigrants in France can be represented through music. And he takes a look at the way music is used to paint both colonial history, so the presence of the French in Algeria, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in colonial times, how music is often a theme of these albums. This can be military chants from soldiers conquering places, or songs about different populations. The music is often a part of these types of stories. And then it goes all the way to modern times, contemporary times, where French society has become much more multicultural, and these ethnic minorities are using music for self-expression. So here you have a group of young Maghrébins, young people from the Maghreb, second generation, third generation immigrants, singing a song, and they're playing with Kabylie. Kabylie is a region of North Africa. En Kabylie, on fait du rock. So these people are singing rock and roll about themselves. They turn rock and roll into a medium to speak about their post-colonial situation. And they're being attacked by skinheads, by fascists, by right-wing or extreme right demonstrators. And it turns into a giant fist fight in the streets. And so it really showcases both self-expression from ethnic minorities and the violence that they have to confront in daily life from these very racist anti-immigrant groups. So it's a statement on contemporary French politics. It's a very political material drawn in these albums, but it's studied through music. Music becomes a focal point in these types of graphic narratives to express identity, history, and other forms of intercultural dialogue. I think this was one of the most challenging chapters to write for the author, precisely because of the silent nature of the comics medium, because it is not typically built for you to hear anything. So you have to mentally reconstruct or think about what sound this could be, and also makes you curious about what the original songs were, how they were borrowed and inserted into these stories, if there's any kind of real connection to any real music, and sometimes there is. Sometimes these are real pieces of music that have been adapted into visual form. So interesting, again, intermedial dialogue between, in this case, graphic novels, a historical setting from colonial times or from post-colonial times, and the medium of music, which is embedded into these graphic constructs. And that's the subject of this chapter. So as you can see, I've gone pretty fast, and I was trying to show you the diversity of the book. But we've dealt with photography, we have dealt with film, we have dealt with music, we have dealt with video games, we've dealt with a photo novel, we've dealt with movies that borrow from comics. We explored these configurations that are quote unquote intermedial in different ways. And I think all these essays complement each other quite well. And they allude to the potential of the medium itself, what graphic novels can do that other media would not be able to do quite as easily, right? The graphic medium has advantages in a way to blend, to mix, to intertwine all kinds of different materials on a single page, to braid, to reuse that term, these materials. These things often are more difficult to accomplish in other mediums. So perhaps one conclusion we can draw from this is that even though the graphic novel has sometimes been presented as a poor artistic form, as an artistic form that doesn't have much nobility, much dignity, because it's associated with childhood, it's associated with pulp fiction. It is assumed not to be particularly inventive or creative or intelligent. All these stereotypes still exist. They're changing thanks to the work of different people, thanks to the quality of these works. We're changing our perceptions. We're studying this in colleges. We're studying this very seriously, in fact. So these perceptions are changing, but one way to change these perceptions is to recognize that graphic novels are more than little images mixed with text. They have the potential to deal with very serious situations, from current immigration issues to the Holocaust, unfortunately, to all kinds of other issues in between, personal narratives, autobiography. It's a rich form of expression, and a lot of graphic novelists have taken advantage of it to create something new that could not be achieved in any other way. And I think that's the conclusion I'd like to leave you with tonight. So thank you so much. And I will stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other if you have any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And for anybody, if you have questions, you can please put them into the Q&A, and I will I'll read them off. I guess I can, but while people are thinking, I guess I could start off.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm very interested in is, I think it's really fascinating, like these different ways that you can like mix all these different media, and not only we see that in French comics, I think we're seeing that in a wide variety. We see that a lot in like Japanese comics as well. Like we see, like not only do they have like manga, they also have like light novels and visual novels. We're talking about video games. I'm just kind of curious, like what, and maybe this is a very ambitious question, but like where do you see comics like going like in the future, especially now when we still have like people who are very weary about about using it, like considering it as like fine literature. Whatever. But
Yeah,
like, where do
yeah.
you see it? Where do you see it going in the future?
Well, it's in terms of being integrated within academia or within teaching in general. I think they've made a lot of progress. You know, I think we do. Now, sometimes there's social backlash. Sometimes there's pushback. Some communities either are resistant to this, but it's a very good teaching tool. You know, it's an excellent tool. You know, there are the wonderful works like Alison Bechdell's, Fun Home, for instance, and it's a wonderful human experience for anyone to read a book like this and empathize with the situation of somebody who may have different situations, different conditions. And we can make very, very empathetic connections with graphic novel. I think when we read about the experiences of other people, which we may not have lived ourselves, we can empathize with them because of the visual nature of the medium and because it is hand traced, hand drawn, it's organic, it's real, it comes from the hand, from the very being of the person who made this. You know, and same thing with the Holocaust. You know, I mean, it's Mouse is just a heartbreaking piece of work, and it's, you know, but if anything can capture the pain and the trauma and the suffering of the post-Holocaust generation that Spiegelman was a member of, it's a work like this, you know, because it is personal, it is genuine, it is real. So I'm really hoping that those qualities can cut through any kind of resistance. You know, some people are resistant to the status of the medium and will tell you, oh, it's not as good as literature, or it's not as good as film. You know, it's little images for little people who can't read or don't have time to read. All those stereotypes are still around a little bit. You see them once in a while. You know, you hear people making jokes about this stuff. But the more Fun Homes and the more Mouses and the more books of that caliber are being produced, I think the more people's attitude will adjust to the fact that this is a medium with very serious potential and with very strong empathetic qualities. I think that's the point I really like to make. Anyone else? I do not see the participants, so.
Just while we're waiting, I actually have one other question.
Yeah,
it's interesting how you mentioned Marjane Satrapi. Another, like one of her, I think one of her mentors was David Bey.
yeah,
I probably mispronounced his name, but
yeah.
He wrote a very interesting book about his brother and his relation with him called Epileptic.
Yeah, Epileptic.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found very interesting about that was, and you see this maybe a little bit in like Persepolis as well, was kind of the use of like surrealism and how he uses like many different kinds of images to like suggest like the state of mind of not just his brother, but also like his own like state of mind and how he feels about it. And I was wondering, do you know like where that came from? Is that like something that came from like French comics or?
Well, I think so. There's a history of, well, so David Bey belonged to a generation that came to prominence in the late 80s and early 90s. There was a publishing house in France called L'Association. It was a publisher in Paris, very experimental in nature. And they didn't want to do commercial graphic novels, commercial comics. They really wanted very personal works, you know, more demanding kinds of works. And it was published mostly in black and white. So that's why Satrapi is in black and white, and David Bey is also in black and white. So they didn't want, you know, anything too flashy, too crazy in terms of the colors. They wanted this sort of basic black and white aesthetic. And they favored these personal types of stories. Another one, well, the leader of the publishing house was Jean-Christophe Menu, who also did a whole series about his own childhood. And so, as you notice in L'Ascension du, I say it in French, L'Ascension du Homme, so the what was it called, it's called Epileptic in English, right? I think they translated just that as epileptic. The story is written by someone whose brother is gradually suffering more and more symptoms of epilepsy, all the points to having these grand mal seizures where he's becoming really very much handicapped by his illness. And it's a little boy who doesn't understand why his brother is turning into something he doesn't quite grasp. And he's using images to come to terms with it. And so he's drawing monsters and different surreal creatures. And so I love the book because it's trying to approximate a kind of a visual idea of a feeling, you know, when you don't have the words to describe or to understand something, when it escapes your grasp, you create these sort of metaphors, you know, these other types of ways to deal with something. And so all the monsters and all the crazy drawings in the story are our child's response to a situation that cannot be really verbalized or cannot be explained. And again, that's why visualizing in comics is another language. You know, it would be really hard to express that with words, especially when you don't have the actual words to say these things. And there's a French tradition of sort of more psychedelic, inventive comics visually. So it didn't pop out of nowhere. I think it was part of an earlier tradition of doing things like that. But it's still kind of a new voice in comics. And I'm also glad that American students have read it, because it's often incorporated in courses on graphic memoir. So when people read Fud Home or when they read Mouse, they also tend to read Persepolis, and they also tend to read David Bay's Epileptic. So the corpus is international, and that pleases me a lot, because those borders are artificial. You know, we can all read in translation, and it's nice to see that the comics world transcends borders, and people influence each other from one side to the next, and the Japanese are also part of the equation. The Japanese, and my daughter, who's behind me next door, has a giant collection of manga. She that's pretty much, you know, she doesn't read my European comics or my American comics. But she collects them, and I have a hard time with them because, you know, as you know, you read backwards, and there's a whole mental shift to adjust to those. But I'm always blown away by the aesthetics. I'm open one of her books and I feel like, wow, the artwork is so smart, the story is so complicated. Like, she really has found true art in these forms. And again, you know, manga are not just, you know, teenage stories of Japanese, you know, adolescent love. You know, they can also be very, I mean, things like Monster, and very complicated, very ambitious as well. So
all right, we do have a question from Sarah Diosrafe. I apologize if I mispronounced that. What graphic novel, if any, are you currently reading?
It's a good question. Well, for a specific project that I'm working on, well, you mentioned when you introduced me that I was involved with the Cambridge companion to the American graphic novel. So, you know, Cambridge University Press has a series of books called the Companion. So there's a Cambridge companion to, and the topics vary, you know, to the American Revolution, to whatever, the American postmodern novel. And there's a series of volumes in this. And so a couple of people and I have been invited to put together a volume of essays on the American graphic novel. And so I really had to refamiliarize myself with like American classics that I had not really studied in my youth, you know, or that were not part of my own library. So I went back to early things like Harvey Kurtzman, you know, who invented Mad Magazine in the 1950s, and who did something called Jungle Book. Jungle Book was kind of a first attempt on a graphic novel, and it's a parody of different things. It's a parody of advertising. It's a parody of 1950s TV series, westerns, different things. It's a time capsule of the 1950s from kind of a leftist New York perspective. And I had not much knowledge of it. I knew it existed, but I never read it. So I went back to read this and thinking, oh, this is really, it's incredible how modern this was. How some pre-graphic novels, some you know, comics from the 1950s already were moving in the direction of the graphic novel, so something more narrative, more complex. So I look back at things like Jules Feiffer did. Jules Feiffer did the Feiffer strips in the Village Voice in New York. Another great Jewish cartoonist from New York. He's still alive. Jules Feiffer is 91 years old and still alive. He did 3 books recently called Kill My Mother, The Ghost Script, and Cousin Joseph. They're film noirs in graphic novel form. They were published between 2007 and 2012, I believe. I mean, no, even later than that, in like late 2010s or so. And as somebody who's in his 90s, started doing comics in the 1940s and 50s. It's still at it, and still inventive and full of life. And so maybe comics keep you young. Maybe if you're 91 years old, if you're Jules Feiffer. And I talked to him. I was able to reach him on the phone. And I had like a 3-hour conversation with him about, growing up in the Bronx in the 1930s. And I had the best time speaking with Jules Feiffer. So I've been going back in time in my readings. Usually I read things that are coming out right now, new texts. I'm interested in African graphic novels, in graphic novels from the French post-colonial world. So that's what I normally would read. But lately I've been sort of going back to the earlier American graphic novelists like Kurtzman or Feiffer.
Yeah, just as a reminder, you have questions. Okay, we got a question from Angela Brummett. Question is, what is your position or opinion on motion comics, enhanced or enchanted comics, which are not animations, but may utilize animation as well as haptic feedback and sound effects in addition to traditional or familiar comic elements?
Yeah, I'm not familiar. I've been reading a little bit about this particular hybrid form, and I think it has a lot of potential, but I really would need to be exposed to a lot more to form an actual opinion. I'm interested in the experimentation. I really think it's always good for people to try different formula, especially when they are a little bit in the margins of our reading habits. We tend to view comics as very static, on one page, and it's actually one of their appeals because you can always go back and flip through pages, and if you're at the bottom of a page and you forgot something, you can go back to the top, and your gaze wanders on the page. And animation is much more like film. It's image after image after image, and there's no going back. So anything that kind of has a combination of the two, I think is a very interesting form of expression. And I applaud those who are trying to make this work. But as I said, I would need a much wider corpus to expose myself to before I would form an opinion. But I'm interested in it, and I think it's great. I cannot tell you if there are any masterpieces already created in this, or if it's in its infancy and it's trying to build steam. I could not quite tell you that. But I'll keep my eye open for this. Thanks for the heads up.
Just a PS. She says, Angela says they're called turbo comics.
Turbo comics, yeah, that's the word that I had seen before. Yeah, turbo comics. It's a cool term. I really like that notion. It's actually I like that wording better than than the other one. Turbo comics, yeah. Welcome.
Any other questions? Angela Brummett again. What about conferences? Which do you recommend?
I assume you're meaning mostly in the United States. So it may have changed name lately. There's something called ICAF. So it's the International Comic Arts Festival. And it's been held for the past more than 20 years, perhaps 30 years, in different places. And it's I've attended a few of those. It moves around. The one time I went to, it was someplace in Vermont. in a very small place called White River Junction that has a cartooning school. So we actually were giving our papers in front of young cartoonists, which was great because they were full of great questions. So Comic-Cons are, typically for fans, and I've also gone to a couple of those with my daughter, just to see what it was like. It's a different world, right? It's not so much an academic perspective on comics, it's more of a fan perspective, and it's great. I mean, it's nice to see people really taking that very seriously. But academic conferences, there's quite a few associations in the US of comics scholars. There's something called a Comics Forum, there's a Comics Journal, and some of those places do have conferences. The Popular Culture Association, of course, the PCA, has an annual conference, and within that Popular Culture Association, there is a comics module or group of comics scholars, and so different panels. I think the next one is in San Antonio. And I saw there's a Koffel paper just came out recently, and then the deadline for applying is on until the 15th of December. So if you want to present a paper, you could go to San Antonio and present a paper there. So there are larger bodies, there's a Society for Narrative, for instance, they don't do just comics, but if you can put together a panel on comics, or you can go see people talk about comics at general conferences like that. So popular culture, narrative studies, visual studies, there are modules on comics in all these big conferences. If you really want to focus just on comics, I think ICAF, the International Comic Arts Festival, would be the #1 big conference.
And the other question related to that is, what about the Angoulême International Comics Festival?
So Angoulême is a classic. So Angoulême is every January. It's cold in Angoulême, right? But the cartoonists themselves are present, and so if you are studying cartoonists, or if you want to meet them, there's all these stands where they sign their work. They do these on-stage conversations with microphones, and you can actually see them do things. Sometimes they even do performances of their comics, so they do projections and talking over them with music. So they do these types of intermedial hybrid spectacles where comics and other things are mixed, for instance, music. Angoulême is wonderful. Angoulême is in a very pretty part of France. Well, there are no ugly parts of France, but this is a especially pretty part of France. So if you have the chance to visit Angoulême, you would absolutely love it. And especially if you are interested in meeting the authors, because they all seem to attend, and they're all very accessible. That's a good thing about also comics writers, is that they, for the most part, don't have very big heads. They don't have big egos. A few of them do, but a lot of them are very happy to talk to their fans and meet with you. So you could possibly do that too.
Okay. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Oh, we did. All right. Angela Burnett asks, will you teach anything related online next semester?
Not next semester, but possibly the following one. So not the spring semester, but the fall semester. And it's likely going to be under the humanities moniker. So we have a humanities program, so the prefix of the course will not be French, it will be humanities, so it will be taught in English. And I will try to do a corpus of different graphic novels, French and Americans, because the humanities program is interdisciplinary. And so I don't want to just do one cultural area. I'd like to be able to travel across different zones. I may even do a couple of Japanese comics if I have time to put that together. So it will be likely in the fall. If you want to reach out to me through my email address, later on this semester or early in the spring, I can let you know a little bit more about the timing of this. But I often do this. My email address, should I type it for you? Let's see, can I type something in here?
Yeah, you can. You should be able to type. I actually typed it in the chat. But yeah, you should be able to type it in there. But I did type yeah, I did type your Louisiana email in the chat, so should be able. So everybody should be able to have it.
Did I type it? Did it go? Did you see it? Got it. Okay. Angela says got it. Okay. Thank you, Angela.
All right. All right. Well, okay. Yeah. Okay. So looks like we're just at time. So once again, thank you all for attending. Thank you very much, Dr. Leroy. That was a really wonderful presentation. For everybody, if any of you are interested in the book, I posted the link to the UL Press, and I also posted if you have any questions for him, his Louisiana email is up on the chat. So thank you very much, Dr. Leroy, and thank you all for attending. And I hope you have a great night.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you, Zach and Janelle, for putting all this together. I really appreciate your support. And thanks for buying books for the library. We love you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.